I think we could start now. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this third seminar in the Greek Dialogues online series. It is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Suzanne Paul, who is keeper of rare books and early manuscripts at Cambridge University Library, and her team. And they're going to talk to us about the Polonsky Foundation Greek Manuscripts project, which aims to digitize, first conserve, catalogue, and digitize the medieval and early modern Greek manuscripts in Cambridge's collections. So a lot of thanks to all of you for joining us, and welcome to Dr. Suzanne Paul. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yanti, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to give you a little overview of the project. It started in early 2019 and was due to be completed by next month, March 2021. Although for entirely understandable reasons, as you can imagine, we have an extension on the project until the end of this year. And the first thing I should say is that this project is a collaboration between Cambridge University Library and Heidelberg University Library. And while we've focused on the Greek manuscripts in Cambridge, they have been working on the Bibliotheca Palatina. And I'm delighted via the magic of Zoom that our colleagues from Heidelberg have been able to join this seminar. So although it's billed as Greek manuscripts in Cambridge libraries, my opposite number in Heidelberg, Dr. Karine Zimmerman, will also say a few words about their work and their collections towards the end of the seminar. Now, we moved this seminar to a daytime slot so that project team members in the UL could show us what they're up to. I should say that in addition to the 3 project researchers who are speaking today, there are 3 full-time dedicated manuscript conservators and 2 photographers working on the project, as well as a part-time project manager, project coordinator, and an outreach coordinator. In the end, we actually felt that the logistics of having everybody speak from so many locations was just too much of a risk in a Zoom world. So I'd like to start with a brief video introduction to the work of the project. Now, we've prepared this video for the Cambridge Festival, so it's aimed at a public rather than a scholarly audience, but it will enable you to see behind the scenes at the UL. So I'll just share my screen and start the video for you now. One of the most interesting things that we've been doing in special collections in the University Library over the past couple of years is the Polonsky Foundation Greek Manuscripts project. So this is a project funded by the Polonsky Foundation to catalogue, conserve and digitise all the Greek manuscripts in Cambridge. And that includes over 400 manuscripts, not just in the University Library, but in the Fitzwilliam Museum and in 12 of the colleges. As you can imagine, this is quite a logistical operation involving a lot of help and goodwill from librarians, photographers and conservators across Cambridge, all working together.
When the Greek manuscript arrives in conservation, the first thing we do is conduct a survey. The survey ascertains the condition of the manuscript and takes note of all the structural features. The conservation treatments focus on minimal intervention. We also use like-for-like materials. This means that on skin-based materials, we use protein-based adhesives, and on paper-based materials, we use starch-based adhesives. The specific treatments that we will be conducting to CUL MS NN236 are pigment consolidation, end band consolidation, leather consolidation, and reattachment of a loose folio. Here at Cambridge University Library, conservation work very closely with the photography department, especially on our most vulnerable manuscripts. During our survey, we produced detailed handling information for our colleagues in photography.
Here at the Digital Content Unit, we follow a specific imaging protocol in order to provide high-quality images that can be consistent over the time. This is made possible by the excellent equipment available to us. I'm working with a Phase 1 digital back and a Schneider lens, plus a specially made conservation cradle. This book cradle allows the photographer to take pictures in the best way without damaging the book. It's actually a much easier process in practice rather than in words, and once you get used to it, it becomes something quite natural. We first take pictures of old rectos, then we rotate the book and do the same for versos, and finally we do the spine of the book. Between each page we use a black background so that all details of the page are visible. This is the last part of the process in the DCU, and after that I can return the book to my colleagues of the cataloguing team.
In cataloguing, we're trying to make the information that a manuscript has to offer readily available but to researchers and to a wider public by drawing together and presenting in an organised form which highlights the distinctive features of a manuscript and makes it possible for those seeking information, whether on texts or the physical development of the production of manuscripts and their history, to actually identify and find the material they're looking for. When I get the manuscript, the first thing I'll do will be to check some of the basic physical details, such as the dimensions, the types of material, the number of folios, the way they're numbered and any anomalies there, and check the basic information which has been recorded by other cataloguers in the past. Typically, I'll then go on to look in more detail at the physical construction of the manuscript, particularly the structure of quires, the small booklets formed of a series of sheets of parchment or paper folded together, on which the text would be copied and which would then be stitched together and bound to form the full book. Typically, in a Greek manuscript, each quire is made up of a set of 8 folios.
So projects like this make a real difference. Not only do they enable us to collaborate with colleagues across Cambridge and in libraries in other parts of the world, so that we can share our skills and expertise, but they also help us to bring our collections to the world. So that gives you a small insight into the project, and you're very welcome. You're very welcome to ask questions. Many of my colleagues who were you see there are actually on the call. So if you have questions about the digitization or the cataloguing, then you're very welcome to ask those later on. Now, to move into the presentation, the 3 speakers on today are the postdoctoral research associates on the project who have been carrying out the cataloguing. So I will just introduce my 3 colleagues. Dr. Christopher Wright has worked on various aspects of the interface between Byzantium and the Latin world in the later Middle Ages, as well as projects in manuscript studies, including cataloguing the Greek manuscripts of Lambeth Palace Library. Dr. Matteo De Franco, his research interests include ancient Greek rhetoric, the Second Sophistic, and textual transmission. His PhD, he edited the speech to Rome by Aelius Aristides. And Dr. Erika Elia, her research focuses on Greek manuscript production, on the history of collections, and the book trade in the 16th century. She's previously worked cataloguing the Greek manuscripts of the Biblioteca Nazionale Universitaria in Torino. So Chris, Matteo, and Erika will talk to you about the Greek manuscripts in Cambridge. Chris.
While this project aims to encompass all the Greek manuscript collections within Cambridge University, boundaries must inevitably be set to its exact scope. The parameters for inclusion are defined in terms of chronology, material, and language. We have excluded items dating from later than 1700 and Greek materials in papyrus collections in Cambridge, focusing on works written on parchment or paper. The most basic criterion, that of language, can also be the most ambiguous in individual cases, where we have had to make judgments on whether manuscripts contain sufficiently substantial content in Greek to qualify for inclusion. This is a consideration mainly at issue in the late end of the chronological range, where we have some manuscripts by English scholars combining transcribed Greek texts or excerpts with notes on commentary in Latin or English. At the beginning of the project, we also performed a search for Greek manuscripts in the university library, which were not immediately identifiable from existing catalogues. While in support of the project, college librarians have identified some previously unremarked Greek manuscripts and fragments in their collections. The number of items now included in the project totals 433, of which 199 are in the university library, 134 in Trinity College, and another 100 divided between 11 other colleges and the Fitzwilliam Museum. Despite their extent and importance, the Cambridge Greek collections have tended to be relatively neglected in past decades. In the course of our work, we have come across various copies of texts which have been omitted from consideration in critical editions. Neglect in the relatively recent past, relatively distant past, can cascade into more recent work, as in the case of Trinity Manuscript 0323, a copy of one volume of the 10th century Byzantine historical compilation, the Scripta Delegationibus, which was long believed lost after being borrowed and sold in error in the 17th century, and was omitted from Carl de Boer's edition of 1903. As a result, it has not been included in some subsequent editions of individual works which were accepted for the collection, and which sometimes survive only as components of it. Hence, there is particular value in the vast magnification of access to these collections, which is possible through digitization, and in the provision through detailed cataloguing of more specific and readily searchable information on their content than was previously available, together with the fuller and better substantiated data on the circumstances of production and modification, which is offered by a thorough physical examination and description. Print cataloguing resources have been available for most of the material we are studying, although, as I mentioned, some of the Greek manuscripts and fragments we have included have been identified during the course of the project or its preparation, while others, generally among the additional manuscripts of the university library, have been acquired too recently to have received previous cataloguing attention. Besides earlier brief inventories, the historic manuscript collection of the university library was catalogued in the middle of the 19th century, while catalogues of the various college libraries were produced by M.R. James in the early 20th century. Greek manuscripts acquired more recently have been the subject of publications by Pat Easterling in the 1960s, describing those of the additional class of the university library, comprising accessions subsequent to the completion of the 19th century catalogue, and those added by colleges and Fitzwilliam Museum since the work of M.R. James. The scope of these surveys across the full range of collections in Cambridge prefigures that of our project. Professor Easterling also generously provided us with unpublished notes, and for some manuscripts at the university library, we've been able to use unpublished notes by the former under-librarian R.V. Kerr. However, at the high level of detail applied in our descriptions, we've been able to greatly expand the range of information available, particularly on physical aspects, but also on the specifics of textual content, together with bibliography. Our catalogue descriptions are coded in XML in accordance with the norms of the Text Encoding Initiative. One of our main tasks at the beginning of the project was finalizing the format for the descriptions. In this, we were guided not only by the parameters of the TEI, but by a more specific style guide for manuscript description within those parameters, which is being developed jointly by Cambridge University Library and the Bodleian. We have continued to update and refine the format of the descriptions as the project has continued, and participate in the improvement of the style guide by providing feedback on issues arising in the course of our work and discussing their resolution. Of course, we have also continued to confer among the three of us to maintain consistency in our approach. Among the choices made was the decision to minimize external links. Where we cite manuscripts in the collections which have been digitized and made available online, we provide links to these. We have in general refrained from giving links to other websites within our descriptions. This is in order to avoid the potential for broken links requiring laborious correction if such resources change their URL structure or become unavailable. We do, however, cite a variety of standard resources in plain text, particularly for the identification of items of textual content. as well as author, title, incipit, explicit, and any rubrics. Texts are identified by reference to identification numbers, where these exist, in resources including the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, Clavis Patrorum Graecorum, Bibliotheca Hagiographica Graeca, and the database of Byzantine book epigrams. Where such reference points are not available, we seek to identify and directly cite editions, or in the case of unpublished text, to cite other manuscripts in which the same text appears. Watermarks in paper are a reference to the closest analogues identifiable in published collections. At the level of the XML markup, rather than the plain text, the names of people and places are also marked up with authority file references to the VAF database and the Getty thesaurus of geographical names, respectively, for indexing purposes. Members of our team who've worked previously on cataloguing projects mentioned that this project differs in being combined with full digitization, so that the descriptions are presented in conjunction with the images and able to complement one another. This influences aspects of our cataloguing practice, particularly in relation to visual aspects of the description, such as obviating the otherwise awkward problem of giving a clear and informative visual description of the manuscript's decoration, as we can simply link to the relevant image. While the structures of the TEI determine the form of the descriptions as prepared and stored, the manner in which they're displayed is determined by the existing design of the Cambridge University Digital Library, and subject to possible modification by future redesigning of that facility. A few of the particulars of how our descriptions are formatted in XML have been tweaked to accord with the peculiarities of the digital library, but in general they are structured by the logic of the TEI independently of how they are presently displayed, and the files should be transferable with minimal alteration to any future update of the digital library and continue to display effectively. Conversely, the level of detail in our descriptions is higher than that of most of the descriptions of other types of material previously published there, and the project has therefore occasioned some limited alterations to the digital library infrastructure to enable our content to make full use of the structural tools available within the TEI repertoire. This is notably the case with regard to the handling of composite manuscripts, in which different parts of the volume have been produced at different times by different scribes and artisans working with different materials and then bound together, whether through the combination of different existing manuscripts or the creation of supplementary material to add to an existing one. In such cases, the TEI structure allows the description to be divided into parts using the MS part tag, providing each physical component with its own description of features such as script, material, layout, and so forth, and grouping those pertaining to each component together, while aspects of the description spanning the whole manuscript, such as the binding or total extent, are described in a single common section. The structure allows flexibility as to which sections are dealt with at the level of the individual part and which at the level of the manuscript as a whole. And we've been able to assign these on a case-by-case basis, depending on how far commonalities run across an entire manuscript. So that, for instance, the dimensions of folios can be represented as a single item across the whole manuscript where these are consistent, but individually for each part where they are not. A key respect in which the representation of descriptions on the digital library differs from the underlying data is that which information from the description appears on screen is determined by which image is displayed. So using the locus information in the XML file, only the information for items of textual content, materials, layout, and so forth, which are relevant to the current image, are presented. The MS part structure of the XML file underlies this presentation in relation to the physical components of the description. However, there is also an option to display the description in full. Since our descriptions are presented online individually alongside the corresponding images, we've been able to publish them incrementally as the project proceeds, once both description and images are available for a given manuscript. This enables the laborious process of proofreading and correction to be spread through the course of the project, rather than having it line weight at the end. Checking descriptions once formative for the digital library has enabled us to identify recurring anomalies not immediately obvious from the files in XML code, so that these can be prevented from occurring in subsequent descriptions. In the course of the project, we have been able to make numerous small discoveries, giving specific identifications to texts only vaguely described in old catalogues, correcting or clarifying dates, and identifying combinations of features suggesting the origins of a manuscript reliable in a particular geographical region, such as southern Italy or Cyprus, or occasionally in a specific scriptorium, such as here, University Library Manuscript Additional 1837, whose peculiarity suggests it is probably a product of the Odigon monastery in Constantinople in the 14th century. Less conspicuous, but often stimulating, is the process of unraveling the physical structure of a manuscript's leaves and the history of production, damage, repair, and augmentation which they reveal. However, the scale of the project, with over 400 items to cover at high level of detail, requires us to keep up a high tempo of work, and there is a limit to how far we can delve into the background and affinities of individual manuscripts. The placement of some within wider contexts may await the scrutiny of specialists, taking advantage of the greater accessibility of these items once placed online. Online presentation makes it possible for further revisions to be made beyond the lifespan of the project if corrections or additional information are suggested by future scholarly examination. However, in the absence of a permanent Greek specialist at the UL, this project is also to an extent a one-time opportunity to give all of these manuscripts as thorough an investigation as possible.
Thank you, Chris. The Cambridge collection of Greek manuscripts distributed among several institutions are not distinguished by thematic or content specificity. The manuscripts have generally been accrued over a long period of time. Three cases diverge from this general picture. The Rouse manuscript at Christ's College, donated by William Rouse, the O class of the Wren Library, which is mainly composed of the manuscript of Thomas Gale, and the Greek manuscript of Gonville and Keyes College, which were donated by John Keyes and contained almost exclusively medical text. The Greek manuscript at Cambridge, included in the project, encompassed text ranging in the date of composition from Homer to the 17th century. The study of Greek at Cambridge has a long history, and an important date is 1528. In that year, the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, donated to the University Library the first Greek book which still remains. It was a printed edition of a Monius Hermia commentary on Porphyry and Hypomnemata in Aristotelis Categorias by Simplicius, printed by Zacharias Kaliergis in Venice in 1499 and 1500. Bound to the same book was the manuscript NN 124, containing the commentary on Porphyry's Isagoge, ascribed to the philosopher Elias. We are now approaching the 5th century of this milestone in Greek studies at Cambridge. The Regius Professorship of Greek was established a few years later, in 1540. Regarding the content of the manuscript, we can see that Christian texts are the most conspicuous. There are numerous copies of Gospel, Evangeliaries, Lectionaries, Menologia and Synaxaria, and texts for prayer and liturgy. Among such texts, there will be the well-known Codex Bezae and Codex Zacyntius stand out. The Church Fathers, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa in particular, are plentifully present, especially in college libraries. A major role in the acquisition of patristic text was played by Richard Bentley, Master of Trinity College from 1700. It seems to have been acquired a considerable number of manuscripts when the abbot of the Pantocrator Monastery on Mount Athos came to England. These manuscripts were bequeathed to Trinity by Bentley, such as B913, which contains various works of Gregory of Nazianzus, but John Chrysostom is also widely present. These manuscripts are venerable in age, dating from between the 10th to the 13th centuries, and considerable in size. They are heavy parchment tomes, elegantly decorated, and bear the monastery's note of ownership. A typical example of this manuscript is B81, a Menologion, which is a service book used in the Eastern Orthodox Church. This manuscript was written in the 12th century. The manuscript is richly decorated, and at the beginning is marked by a pula, a decoration in form of a gateway, in red, blue, green, and white paint, and gold, and vegetative ornament. Another of Bentley's manuscript is the Gospel book B1017 of 13th century. They almost display signs of monastic use, even down to the presence of candle wax on the pages. Classical authors are represented by a smaller number of manuscripts, but nevertheless remarkable. It must be remembered that in these cases, manuscripts are a means of access to the text, and that the search for such witnesses became increasingly intense in the 17th and 18th centuries. I would like to present here some examples of manuscripts of greater textual authorities. The first example is the manuscript CUL-FF58. This is a 12th or 13th century parchment copy of the Ars Rhetorica by Aristotle, known as Codex F in Cassel's Stemma. This is the second oldest manuscript copy of Aristotle's treatise, after the Parisinus Graecus 1741, Siglum A, dated to the second half of the 10th century. The Cambridge manuscript bears some marginal comments by Demetrius Chalcondyles, one of the most eminent Greek émigré scholars active in Italy in the late 15th century. The unusual oblong format suggests an Italian origin, although the characteristics of the writing indicate a scribe of Constantinopolitan background. The manuscript is the progenitor of the richest branch of the textual tradition in terms of number of descendants, and 6 preserved manuscripts are direct copies of it. We have clear evidence that Cambridge classical scholars worked on the manuscript available in libraries here. The great scholar Richard Porson added a note in this 15th century copy of Thucydides, NN 318, and numbered the books in the margins. A manuscript in the Wren Library also attracted his attention. Manuscript 039, probably produced in the 12th century, is the oldest surviving copy of the lexicon of Photius, sometimes called the Codex Gallianus. Photius is one of the most important figures in Byzantine intellectual and religious history, and he played a prominent role at the early stage of the literary revival in 9th and 10th century Byzantium. The manuscript is missing some of the text, but it was studied by leading scholars, including Joseph Scaliger, Isaac Cosbon, Richard Bentley, Johann Reiske, and Richard Porson. He spent nearly a year making a corrected transcription of the entire text to be the basis of a printed edition, but it was destroyed by fire. His second transcription was printed posthumously by Peter Paul d'Aubry in 1822. The Trinity College Codex was the main witness to the work of Photius until a complete copy of the text was found in the monastery of Zavorda in Greece in 1959. The manuscript CULDD 463 is an example of a Codex Unicus. This 15th century manuscript contains 3 lexicographic treatises and is known to be the only copy of what is called the Lexicon Rhetoricum Cantabrigiense. The main text is the Lexicon Indecem Oratores Atticus by the 2nd century Greek grammarian Valerius Arpocration from Alexandria. The Lexicon Rhetoricum Cantabrigiense exists in the marginal notes on the folios of this copy of Arpocration's lexicons, and was edited by d'Aubry as an appendix to Porson edition of Photius' lexicon. One interesting current group of manuscripts in the university library contains dramatic text. They all come from the library of Anthony Askew, an 18th century physician and bibliophile. His favorite author was Aeschylus, and Askew himself printed in Leiden in 1746 a small specimen of a new edition of Aeschylus, but the edition was never completed. Manuscript NN33 and NN313 to 17 preserve some comedies of Aristophanes and some dramas of Euripides. Some of them were originally part of the same manuscript, that were later split and rearranged. These manuscripts come from the Paleologian period, the last before the fall of Constantinople, when numerous manuscripts of ancient authors and commentaries were produced. Many Askew manuscripts are important witnesses to the Byzantine textual tradition of commentaries and scholia on ancient drama. In particular, an N33, a 15th century copy of the Plutus and Claudius by Aristophanes, contains scholia by the 13th or 14th century Byzantine grammarians Thomas Magistros and Demetrius Triclinius. NN 313, written in the 1480s, contains the Euripidean dyad, that is Hecuba and Orestes. The triad also included the Phoenician women, and is the main representative witness to the family of the delta dyad recension, therefore it's known as the Cambridge dyad. It also contains scholia by Thomas Magistros and Manuel Moschopoulos.
Cambridge Greek manuscript collections cover a period of at least 13 centuries, from the end of the 4th or the beginning of the 5th century, with the already mentioned Codex Beze, University Library NN 241, the famous bilingual manuscript of the Gospels, to the 8th century Scriptio Inferior of Codex Sapientius, University Library Additional 10,062, the palimpsest, which is considered the oldest New Testament Catena manuscript. A digital edition resulting from a collaboration between the University of Birmingham's Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing and Cambridge University Library has recently been launched. The Middle Byzantine period is represented here by, for example, University Library II 544, a collection of ethical treatises by Aristotle, which was copied in 1279 by the scribe Nicolaus in southern Italy in the monastery of San Salvatore in Lingua Fari, an important center of Italo-Greek monasticism. Together with manuscript Vaticanus Graecus 1342, it constitutes the Recensio Messanensis of Aristotle's ethical treatises. Manuscripts from the 15th or 16th century are fairly numerous. Here's an example from a collection we are currently working on, Gonville and Keyes College. The Greek manuscripts of this collection were donated by John Keyes, the second founder of the college. The majority of Keyes' manuscripts contain medical text. This is not surprising, as he was a physician well-versed in Greek. He translated into Latin, published, and commented on various Greek medical texts. He probably acquired the majority of his manuscripts during his travels in Italy in 1539-1544, and possibly not always in the most lawful ways. The collection is quite interesting. Having been kept together in the same place, it allows an analysis of the interest of the scholar who put it together, but also an insight into the management practices put in place by the scholar with his books. An example. Frequently, the manuscripts of Keyes are composite, formed of originally independent units. This is the first leaf of Gonville and Keyes 4724, a composite manuscript formed of 4 parts of different ages, provenance, and size, all containing medical texts bound together by John Keyes. The first part was copied in the 15th century, and the scribe has been possibly identified as the Cretan Georgios Tsangaropoulos. It contains the first 6 books, the last is incomplete, of Galen, Method of Healing, the Metodo Medendi. The text must have been already incomplete when it came in the hands of John Keyes, who had the rest of the work copied by another scribe. This continuation of the work is bound in another smaller manuscript, Gonville and Keyes 360-587. This is also a composite volume, in this case formed of 2 parts. The second part is clearly intended as a continuation. The text starts from the exact point where it ends in manuscript 4724, as does the pagination. Composite manuscripts can result in rather complicated TI documents. On the other hand, it is exactly in cases such as these that the characteristics of an online catalog can be precious. In this case, it is possible, for instance, to link directly the 2 descriptions of parts of different manuscripts, making the link between the 2 separate objects more immediately appreciable for the reader. As an aside, in setting a date limit of 1700 for our project, we had to exclude Greek manuscripts in Cambridge collections dating from the 16th and 19th centuries. Like, for example, this fragment, University Library Additional 2754.4, a text written in the 19th century by Georgios Redestenos, Protopsaltes, chief singer of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. A peculiarity of the Cambridge collections is the presence of a conspicuous number of Greek manuscripts copied by Western European scribes, mostly by English scholars, in the 16th and more frequently 17th centuries. This is not a characteristic found so widely in other Greek manuscripts collections. Some of these manuscripts are collations, transcriptions, and notes by scholars, which testify to the multiple scholarly networks and the struggle to access Greek texts in this period. University Library DD 529, the previous images, contains a series of transcriptions, notes, and collations written by the 17th century English writer Abednego Seller from various manuscripts, including a codex owned by Humphrey Wanley, British Library Arundel 516, and manuscript Trinity R 918. Trinity College preserves some manuscripts owned by the English academic and clergyman Herbert Thorndike, apparently relating to his never-fulfilled project of a new edition of Origen. He copied text himself, like manuscript Trinity B911, which contains the extant books of Origen's commentaries on the Gospel of John, copied from a manuscript in the Bodleian. Thorndike also got manuscripts from other scholars, as in the case of Trinity B910, which contains the anonymous dialogue Directa in Deum Fide, on the true faith in God, traditionally attributed to Origen. It was copied from two Parisian manuscripts by two 17th century scribes. One of them is Claude Sarraut, also known as Claudius Arabius. Sarraut declares in a colophon that he made a copy for his friend and correspondent, the Dutch scholar and manuscript collector Isaac Vossius, who eventually gave the manuscript to Thorndike. Text could also be copied, of course, from printed edition, like Manuscript University Library DD 684, which contains Lycophron's Alexandra, accompanied by a synoptic Latin translation by the 16th century classical scholar Willem Cantor. The manuscript was probably copied from a printed edition. Later manuscripts by Western European hands can also contain original texts, such as a Greek tragedy written in the Tudor age, Jefte by John Christopherson, chaplain and confessor to Queen Mary Tudor and master of Trinity College. The tragedy, inspired by Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis, has its protagonist Jefte, or Jefta, a judge of Israel who sacrificed his daughter in consequence of a vow. Both the only known copies of the Greek play are in Cambridge. Can we have the image, please? Okay, thank you. St. John's College H19, dedicated to Cuthbert Tunstall, and Trinity 0137, dedicated to William Parr, brother of Henry VIII's sixth wife and first Earl of Essex. They receive a manual of private daily prayer composed in Greek and Latin by the famous preacher Lancelot Andrews, Bishop of Chichester and Winchester under James I. Pembroke manuscript LC 174 contains the Greek version of the Preces Private, one of Andrews' most popular works, copied by Samuel Bright, Andrews' secretary. In the world of classical philology, it is said that recensores non deteriores. This principle, however, applies generally to manuscripts up until the 15th or 16th century. Later ones are barely considered in bibliography. However, this can prove very interesting, not only because they give testimony to the interests and relationships of the scholars they are linked to, but also, for instance, in a cultural historical perspective, for the reconstruction and study of the context in which the books were produced. An example which comes to mind is a manuscript from the collection of Roger Gale, Trinity 023, a manuscript whose production, according to the analysis and study by Richard Vagione, is to be linked with the Arian debate of the beginning of the 18th century. The manuscript contains two texts by Eunomius, 4th century bishop of Cyzicus. Because of his adherence to the Christian heresy of Arianism, condemned by the Council of Constantinople in 381, few of his works survive. Analysis of the manuscript, which contains the Expositio Fidei, Exposition of Faith, and Liber Apologeticus, the Apology, reveals that it was copied sometime between 1697 and 1738. While the first work was copied probably from the printed edition of 1668, the Apology was transcribed from a manuscript now Lambeth Palace Library, manuscript 802, which was owned by Thomas Tennyson, Archbishop of Canterbury. The codex was possibly used by the Cambridge theologian and mathematician William Whiston for his English translation of the Liber Apologeticus. He succeeded Isaac Newton as Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, but was removed from his chair and expelled from the university for his Arianism. These late manuscripts present the cataloger with numerous challenges. Since they are not normally the object of study in the field of classical and Byzantine philology, or in Greek manuscript studies more generally, they are usually not cited in bibliographies or considered in the main repertoires of scripts, for example. For such materials, but not only for them, online digitization within an interpretative framework could help build sets of data which are useful for future research. Encouraging and facilitating further research is precisely the aim of this project.
Thank you, Matteo, Chris, and Erica. I'd now like to pass over to our colleagues in Heidelberg. Dr. Karine Zimmerman is going to just talk briefly about the manuscripts that they've been working on as part of their project. Karine?
Hello from Heidelberg. Thank you, Suzanne. I hope you can see my presentation. Yes, at first I want to thank for the opportunity to say a few words about the Heidelberg part of the Greek manuscript project funded by the Polonsky Foundation. Pretty much like Cambridge, we had to digitize and still have to catalog more than 400 Greek manuscripts. In particular, and different from the colleagues in Cambridge, we are dealing with textual witnesses of only one historic collection, the so-called Bibliotheca Palatina. This library grew from the foundation of Heidelberg University in 1386 until its heyday in the 16th and 17th century. At that time, the collection consisted of about 2,000 Latin, 850 German, 448 Greek, and 270 Hebrew manuscripts and more than 13,000 early prints. During the 30 Years' War, the whole library was taken as booty to the Vatican Library. This is the reason why today this collection is divided between two locations, Heidelberg and the Vatican. Only the German and very few of the Latin and Greek manuscripts came back to Heidelberg. The much bigger part is still kept in the stacks of the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana. That means from our part of the project that the catalogers only have physical access to 29 Greek manuscripts that are back in Heidelberg. 394 codices have to be described remotely and only by the means of digital facsimiles. Fortunately, we already have a rich experience with this kind of scientific working from afar. Since the 1960s, the Latin Palatine manuscripts at the Vatican Library became catalogued in different projects, and between 2012 and 2018, the more than 2,000 Latin manuscripts were digitized locally at Rome by Heidelberg staff and can be used online. And so we were very happy to get the opportunity with this collaborative project to also digitize and catalog the Greek manuscripts of the Bibliotheca Palatina. This is, so to speak, the keystone of the virtual reunification of the Palatine Library. Because of the fact that we already were stationed with our digitization team at the Vaticana, We digitized the Greek Palatine manuscripts over there subsequently to the Latin ones, and so they are online since November 2019. Aside from the Palatine anthology, Codex Palatinus Graecus 23, a collection of more than 3,700 epigrams written in the 10th century, and probably the most famous and perhaps the most important Greek manuscripts of the Palatine collection, it consists of many early modern composite manuscripts that had been produced in the 15th and 16th century to sell them to humanists who are keen to learn more about Greek literature and texts. But there also can be found some early service books and liturgical manuscripts from the 10th century, or many literary works that cover the whole Greek literature culture. At the end of these really few words, I want to introduce the three colleagues who are describing the Greek Palatine manuscripts here at Heidelberg University Library. These catalogers are Lars Hoffmann. He has a great experience in describing Greek manuscripts for many years, and Vincent Gottlieb, who is here with me in the library, and Paul Neuendorf. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. And now I think we have some time for questions. If anybody wants to raise a question, I guess you can put it in the chat or use the reactions tab to raise your hand if you have a question.
Well, thank you very much for the very informative and impressive presentation of the project. So yes, please, if anybody has something to put in the chat, or unmute yourselves and just ask.
Hello, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I would like to ask if someone could speak a little bit about the illuminated manuscripts, illuminated Byzantine manuscripts that might be either in Heidelberg or in Cambridge.
Yes, there are a number of illuminated, certainly biblical manuscripts in Cambridge. Quite a few of these in the Fitzwilliam Museum, which we have not yet been able to catalogue. One of the difficulties arising from the coronavirus, we haven't been able to get into to deal with those yet. Also, some others in other collections. So primarily Gospel manuscripts. Certainly, there's also some Acts and Epistles with miniatures of the writers of the text. Also, some manuscripts of the life of Balaam and Joasaph. We have a fragment of that with a number of surviving complete miniatures, and another full manuscript with illustrations drawn in ink for the most, only ink for the most part, but a few of these have also been painted, and that probably isn't part of the original scheme, though there's been a degree of uncertainty on that. Possibly, probably the most interesting one that I worked on previously is Gospel manuscript in the University Library, DD 969, which has a number of evangelist miniatures in the style of the 10th century, though the manuscript itself is considerably later, in the late 13th, so that it's uncertain whether these have been salvaged from an older manuscript or have actually been produced in an archaizing style. There are also a couple of miniatures in there of the style contemporary to the production of the manuscript, but which have evidently been reused from another manuscript because the dimensions clearly been cut down. So there are various ambiguous things going on with how that one has been assembled.
Suzanne, I think there is a question on the chat by Marina Tumburi. Have you come across newly discovered illuminated manuscripts during cataloguing? I don't know if you would respond to that.
Not newly discovered, no. The degree to which the collections have been covered by cataloguing in the past, that has been previously remarked, where illuminations exist, we haven't turned up any further ones, no.
I think the same is true in Heidelberg. I mean, I think you have a few illuminated manuscripts, but they are all known in advance.
Yes, Suzanne, that's right.
There are very few. The two most important are the Palatinus Graecus 381. These are miniatures from the Psalter, and the 431. This is the famous Joshua wall. Except of these two, there are some pictures which are in the margin, but not really illuminated manuscripts. The most of them are only text.
There is another question, which I think it has come directly to me, but it's supposed to be for the speakers, I think. Will the descriptions accompanying the digital images allow for later amendments or expansion?
Yes, I think that's part of the attraction, I think, of digital cataloguing, is that there is scope to expand. So each description is accompanied by a bibliography, and at a very minimum, we'll be looking to update that bibliography as new work is published that's relevant to the manuscripts. And yeah, if there are significant changes or amendments, then we would look to update the records. I think our Greek manuscript records are fuller than many of the other records in the digital library. So they cover all the elements that you would expect, but yeah, we can update them. And to answer Jenny's question about identifying manuscripts that had not previously been flagged as Greek, this is partly due to the 19th century catalogue of the University Library manuscripts, which, of its time, of the mid-19th century, excellent, comprehensive, 5 volumes, doesn't always tell you what language a manuscript is written in. Like, there's actually very basic information missing sometimes from those descriptions. So there was a lot of combing through to identify manuscripts that were perhaps, transcriptions of other Greek manuscripts, and questioning whether they were Greek enough to be included, whether, is a lexicon with how much Greek does it need to have to be considered a Greek manuscript and to be worked on for this project.
And if I may add something about this, colleges were encouraged to look at their own collection. And in one case, for example, the Pembroke, the Christ College found a new manuscript. Actually, it was not it wasn't a collection, but deemed lost for about two centuries. So it was newly discovered because it was deemed as lost, but actually was in the library, and now it's on the digital library as well. So it never left the college, but was deemed, and thanks to this project, it was found again in the library. So a new item was found in some colleges.
And we've also found fragments among more general fragment collections. Our fragment collections are not always distinguished by language, so there were Greek fragments among Latin and other languages. Karine, I don't know whether you or any of your team could answer Tim's question.
Yes, I just saw it as a whole. Yes, we are having a special project about the Palatine anthology at the SFB, and perhaps I can give, we can exchange emails, because the Palatine anthology is not yet catalogued in this Greek manuscripts project, because as you can imagine, it's one of the most important manuscripts, and it won't be so fast to be described. And but we are having a special kind of project in another part of the running these projects.
I think, Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Yes, she does actually.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is so fascinating, listening to you all talk about your finds and seeing, well, I wish at this point everyone would put their videos on, but seeing people, we're sort of visualizing knowledge circuits. And I mean, normally when we work on early modern manuscripts, what we get excited about is who, you know, the names linking up, who stole it from whom and who bought it from whom, this exchange. But so what I see you all, and I want to know, how often do you do this? Does Heidelberg get together with Cambridge? Is maybe it more possible for you to talk to each other? Do you write about your finds to share with us who aren't there present in the room when you have that moment of where the knowledge is moving about? This is just the most, so I'm interested in some of you talking about really the process of your knowledge circuit, how you're sharing this very possibly ephemeral buzz, you know, of discovery, and how you're noting that down in your archive.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the impetus for the collaborative nature of the project comes from the Polonsky Foundation. They have a tendency to pair institutions to collaborate, and it is to create those knowledge circuits, to share knowledge and to build partnerships. And I think that's been really valuable. In the before times, we traveled to Heidelberg, and Karine has been to Cambridge several times. So we have calls, and we have had physical visits to each other to share information, around processes and around discoveries. I mean, Matteo found a Greek manuscript that had a German inscription in it, which was very helpful to have, colleagues who could identify, translate, and give a context for that. So we have been learning from each other and sharing that information. I don't know if anyone else on the team wants to say more. I think there's also the conservators and the photographers. The conservators particularly are also finding out information about the manuscripts. You know, they are investigating their physical makeup, and they often make discoveries, things about dating or provenance that they can share with us. So that's been really interesting, having different spheres of knowledge within the project, able to sort of share.
If I could just sort of come back briefly, I think that what you're talking about right now is something that also needs to be documented, in the sense that this is something that maybe isn't being written about by any of you. I don't know. I mean, but it is part of the process of digitization that's really fascinating in terms of history scholarship and history of technology that might not be part of what people normally talk about.
Absolutely. I think within digitization projects generally, there is a sort of growing awareness of the invisible labor that lies behind these projects, and how we can surface that and all the knowledge and skill that goes into what you see on the digital library, and I think that is a really valuable thing to share that. Just another couple of quick questions. Georgi asking about the Greek fragments from the Cairo Geniza. No, we haven't covered the Geniza fragments. I think they are fairly specialist. There's no reason why they couldn't be the topic of a future project. We have been collaborating with the Geniza project on an exhibition. Yes, trying to put on an exhibition in the university library in COVID times has been entertaining. But next week we open an exhibition called Ghost Words, Reading the Past, which is about palimpsests. So it includes quite a few, maybe a dozen Greek manuscripts from the project, along with manuscripts from the Cairo Geniza that are palimpsests. So that we've actually installed the exhibition, filmed it, and uninstalled the exhibition. So there's going to be a 3D video walkthrough and kind of virtual exhibition and events around palimpsests starting next week. So that's just a kind of public service announcement. Emmanuel's question, in terms of the virtual Biblioteca Palatina, Karine.
Yeah, it was very lucky that we had the chance in 2010 to start a great collaborative project with the Vatican Library when we started another virtual library project, the virtual library of the Monastery of Loche. And it was that 133 Latin manuscripts that had been written in Loche or had been part of the Loche Library in the meantime are as part of the Biblioteca Palatina in the Vatican Library. And so we asked the Vatican if it is possible to digitize these manuscripts. And that was the start of this really great collaboration between these two libraries. And as I said, short in my few words, we went to Rome, and we had a little flat, and we had a studio in the building of the Vatican, where we had our digitization studio, and we were working there with one staff member of Heidelberg University Library and a few students who made the digitization, and that was the start. That was the beginning of this great project, and there it was very lucky that we had the possibility with this project, with the Polonsky project, to also add the digitization of the Greek manuscripts. So, and we were very, very lucky that we had the colleagues in the BAV who just say, yes, you can come and you can do that. And I mean, it was a win-win situation, I guess.
Yeah, I think that virtual Biblioteca Palatina is now a reality on your website with the Greek, the German, and the Latin all present.
Yes, and we also add the Hebrew ones. They are now in the Vatican collection. They are in a Palatine collection, not in the Vatican collection, and there are still 20 manuscripts left in different languages, in Arabic, in Syriac, and in Indian language, but they are all digitized, and they will be published in the next weeks, I think, and then it will really be the rest of the manuscripts of the former Biblioteca Palatina that can be seen as a whole on this virtual library. That's nice, yeah.
Are there any more questions? Does anybody else want to ask? Okay, then thank you very much to everybody. If you do have further questions, feel free to email us to contact the project. But thank you all for coming today. It's been really great to share the project with you.
Thank you to all the speakers. Please watch out for new online dialogues, Greek dialogues. You will be informed about the next session. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again, and let's have a virtual applause for the speakers. Thank you. Goodbye.